September 27, 1942. The morning fog over San Francisco Bay lifted slowly, revealing a sight that seemed to suspend belief. At the edge of the water, in the roar and glow of floodlights, a ship, 441 feet of welded steel, slid down its ways and struck the surface with a booming hiss. Steam rose from the bay, mingling with the smoke of 1,000 torches. The crowd erupted. In the space of 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes, an entire ocean-going vessel had been built from keel to launch. The SS Robert E. Peary was not simply a ship. It was proof that the impossible could be made routine. 2 years earlier, the idea would have been dismissed as fantasy. In 1940, the United States stood half awake, still trading neutrality for comfort, while across the Atlantic, the ocean had become a graveyard. German U-boats stalked convoys from Newfoundland to Gibraltar. Merchant ships burned in the night. Sailors clung to rafts in Black Seas. Britain's survival depended on supplies that were vanishing faster than shipyards could replace them. A single Liberty-type cargo ship required more than 200 days to complete. Every loss deepened the gap between production and destruction. The arithmetic was merciless. At that rate, the Allies would bleed dry before the first American soldier landed in Europe. In Washington, the U.S. Maritime Commission searched for miracles. They spoke of new tonnage, of standard designs, of mobilization. What they needed was not just steel, they needed speed. And into that vacuum stepped a man who, by all logic, had no business being there. Henry John Kaiser had never built a ship. He had built everything else. From the Hoover Dam to the Grand Coulee, his name was carved into the concrete of the American West. He was a builder of impossible things, an optimist with a stopwatch for a heart. He believed that time itself could be engineered. Where others saw rivets and drafts, he saw systems, the movement of men, machines, and ideas in harmony. To him, industry was choreography. When Kaiser first met Vice Admiral Emory S. Land, head of the Maritime Commission, the admiral listened politely and tried not to laugh. Kaiser proposed to mass-produce cargo ships like automobiles, using assembly line logic. Land replied that ships were not cars. They were traditions floating on craftsmanship. He said, "You can't build a ship like a car." Kaiser smiled. "Then we'll build them like tomorrow depends on it." It did. By early 1941, the shoreline north of Oakland was unrecognizable. Bulldozers carved through mud. Rails, cranes, and sheds rose in geometric rows. Kaiser's partnership with Permanente Metals gave him access to steel, welding talent, and the reckless faith of a construction man who measured progress in months, not years. The Richmond shipyards were born, a grid of factories masquerading as docks. Unlike traditional yards where a hull took shape plank by plank, Richmond was divided into numbered zones. Each bay built a different segment, the bow here, the stern there, the engine room somewhere in between. When ready, the pieces would be lifted by colossal cranes and fused together on the launching ways. The process was modular, parallel, and alive. The secret was welding. For centuries, ships had been held by rivets, red-hot pins hurled, caught, hammered, and sealed by teams of men working in deafening rhythm. It was craftsmanship worthy of legend, but hopelessly slow. Welding fused steel plates into a single continuous skin. It was faster, lighter, and, in the hands of new workers, democratic. Anyone could learn to weld in weeks. Riveting required years. To traditional shipwrights, it felt like sacrilege. To Kaiser, it was salvation. The first contracts went to the newly formed Permanente Metals Corporation. The design was standardized. The EC-2 Liberty ship, simple, box-like, with a single triple expansion engine that could push her at 11 knots. Critics called her the ugly duckling. Kaiser called her the key to the Atlantic. He did not care about grace, he cared about multiplication. Quantity has a quality of its own, he told his managers. We are going to prove that arithmetic wins wars. Day and night the yards grew. Diesel engines rattled, compressors screamed, and floodlights turned the bay into a second sun. Trains arrived hourly, offloading steel plate, pipes, and prefabricated bulkheads. Supervisors walked with stopwatches and clipboards. The scale was staggering. By mid-1942, the Richmond complex employed over 90,000 people. Entire neighborhoods sprouted around it, hastily built rows of housing for the workers who poured in from every corner of the country. They came from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and the Carolinas. They came with children, with hopes, with fear of failure, and found themselves swept into an enterprise larger than any they had known. Kaiser's genius was not only in steel, but in people. He believed morale was a production tool. He ordered canteens to serve hot meals around the clock, built childcare centers so women could weld by day and still raise families by night, and opened an on-site hospital that treated industrial injuries within minutes. Out of that hospital grew the first prototype of the Permanente health plan, a concept so simple and humane that it would outlive the war itself. A healthy worker is a faster worker, Kaiser said, but in his eyes, it was also right. By the summer of 1942, a new rhythm pulsed through Richmond. Sparks fell like orange rain. Trains and cranes moved to a choreography of whistles. Women in coveralls, their hair tied in bright kerchiefs, stood shoulder to shoulder with men on scaffolds. They called themselves burners, fitters, scalers, and welders. Many had never held a tool before. Within weeks, they were constructing vessels bound for the Atlantic. The shipyards became a city of purpose, a place where skill was earned, not inherited. In that fever of creation, time compressed. The first Liberty ship at Richmond took 150 days, the next 110, then 90. Within a year, the average fell below 50. America's newspapers began to take notice. "Ships by the dozen," one headline read. "Kaiser's factories float to war." He grinned at the exaggeration, but knew it was close to truth. The war in Europe still hung in doubt. U-boats continued to strike, tankers burned off the coast of Florida. But for the first time, the line on the production chart bent upward faster than losses. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's yards alone had launched more than 200 Liberty ships. The system worked. What remained was to prove how far it could go. That proof would come with a wager, a challenge thrown across the factory floor one restless afternoon. Kaiser gathered his foremen and said, "Gentlemen, we've cut months to weeks. Let's see if we can cut weeks to days." Laughter followed, then silence, then a murmur of belief. The target: build one complete Liberty ship in less than 5 days. The experiment would become legend. At Richmond Yard No. 2, preparations began in secret. Every plate was cut, every bolt pre-drilled, every component laid out like an orchestra of parts waiting for the downbeat. The ship chosen for the trial was the SS Robert E. Peary, named after the Arctic explorer. Construction would start on November 8, 1942. Engineers scheduled the sequence minute by minute. There would be no delay, no idle crane, no missing rivet. Crews rehearsed the moves like dancers on a stage of steel. The world watched with skepticism. Even Kaiser's allies doubted it could be done. But in Richmond, the torches ignited and the clock began to tick. Welders worked under floodlight through the night. Trucks rumbled through the gates in endless chains. Foremen barked through loudspeakers as sparks cascaded like rain. The entire yard moved to a single heartbeat. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the Robert E. Peary touched the water. The crowd exploded. Reporters scribbled in disbelief. Admiral Land, the skeptic-turned-witness, leaned toward Kaiser and said, simply, "You've changed the world." What began as an experiment became a doctrine. Speed itself was now a weapon, as vital as any gun or plane. And in the months that followed, the rhythm of Richmond would echo across America's coasts from Portland to Pascagoula. A new kind of warfare had begun, one fought not with bullets, but with blueprints, welds, and time.
The sound of progress in 1943 was not the thunder of guns, but the hum of welders. Across Richmond's shipyards, arcs of blue-white light danced along seams of steel, sealing together the skeletons of ships that would soon carry America across the world. Each flash was a heartbeat in a vast mechanical organism, a living factory stretching for miles. At its center stood Henry Kaiser, pacing the catwalks with a hard hat and a stopwatch, his eyes scanning for inefficiency the way a general looks for weakness in his line. To outsiders, the shipyards seemed chaotic, sparks flying, cranes swinging, whistles blaring, but beneath the noise was order, almost mathematical. The real innovation was not in metal, but in movement. Kaiser had imported the discipline of the Ford Motor Company, the synchronization of the Hoover Dam, and the logistics of an army, and fused them into a single process that made the ocean itself seem conquerable. The first principle was parallelism. In traditional shipyards, a hull was built like a cathedral, from keel to deck, one phase after another, in sequence. At Richmond, Kaiser broke that tradition apart. The hull was divided into sections, and each section became its own production line. One bay fabricated bow assemblies, another built midship sections, another prepared deck houses. When complete, cranes moved them into place like puzzle pieces. While one hull was being welded, another was being outfitted, and a third was already being painted. Time was no longer linear. The second principle was standardization. The Liberty ship's design was deliberately simple, 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, and made of about 250,000 individual parts. By standardizing everything from doors to portholes to boilers, Kaiser's teams could produce components interchangeably, regardless of yard or shift. A door from Oregon could fit a ship in California. A winch from Portland could install in Richmond without adjustment. The result was modular precision, something no shipyard had achieved before. Welding was the visible revolution, but logistics was the invisible one. Behind the cranes and torchlight stood an army of planners with slide rules and index cards. They tracked every rivet, every ton of steel, every man-hour, turning chaos into flow. The Richmond yards used a color-coded schedule chart, a rainbow of production lines that showed where each section should be hour by hour. Where delays occurred, the charts shifted like battle maps. Every weld counted. Every hour lost meant another ship adrift in the Atlantic. Efficiency reached obsessive levels. Forklifts replaced handcarts. Prefabricated sections were placed on rolling tracks so they could be pushed from one station to the next without cranes. Tool rooms were redesigned so that welders spent seconds, not minutes, finding what they needed. The average Liberty ship once required over 1.5 million man-hours. By 1944, Kaiser's yards built one with less than 600,000. The savings were not just numbers, they were ships that lived instead of ships that died. As production expanded, so did the complexity of coordination. 7 Kaiser yards now dotted the West Coast. Richmond, Portland, Vancouver, and others, each a city unto itself. To synchronize them, Kaiser introduced what he called the assembly democracy. Meetings were held daily between engineers, union foremen, and even line welders to propose solutions. Innovations could rise from anywhere. One week, a worker suggested pre-painting steel sections before assembly to reduce rust. The next, a foreman designed a new rolling platform to carry engines straight to the launchways. Each idea shaved minutes, and minutes became ships. For all its scale, the machine retained a human heartbeat. Kaiser's management believed fatigue was the enemy of precision. He ordered that coffee and food be available 24 hours a day. Shift rotations were designed to maintain rhythm rather than burnout. He said, "The ship won't move faster if the people break first." Unlike many industrialists of the age, Kaiser walked the floors. He spoke with welders by name, asked about their families, and carried a pocket full of production cards, jotting notes and suggestions as he went. The workforce was a mirror of wartime America, a nation compressed into one place. There were farmers from Kansas, miners from Pennsylvania, ranchers from Texas, and housewives from every state in between. They spoke with accents from Brooklyn to the Bayou. For many, the shipyard was the first steady job they had ever known. For others, it was an escape from prejudice or poverty. Kaiser's hiring policy was revolutionary for its time. Skill mattered more than background. Anyone who could learn was welcome. That inclusiveness became a quiet social revolution. Thousands of African Americans migrated west during the war, drawn by the promise of steady pay and fairer treatment than the Jim Crow South could offer. The Richmond yards employed over 10,000 black workers by 1944, working alongside whites and women in an environment that, while not free from tension, was more equal than most of America. There were conflicts, housing shortages, wage disputes, moments of racial friction, but there was also progress. For the first time, production required unity. Kaiser's managers discovered that diversity was not a burden, but a strength. Each group brought unique skills: Southerners with welding experience from railroads, Midwest farmers who understood machinery, and West Coast women who adapted quickly to technical training. Together, they formed a workforce that no single trade school could have imagined. "We were learning from each other as we went," recalled a foreman. "Every shift was a classroom, every ship a final exam." While Richmond grew into the symbol of modern shipbuilding, the competition to build faster spread across the nation. Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation, one of Kaiser's affiliates, developed its own techniques, rolling the entire stern assembly on giant wheeled platforms to the hull. In Los Angeles, CalShip experimented with mobile cranes that could lift 100 tons at once, replacing fixed gantries. The lessons of Richmond became templates for an entire wartime industry. Kaiser's innovations also changed the way the government viewed contractors. Before him, the Maritime Commission treated shipbuilders as slow-moving artisans, paid by the hour, and rewarded for caution. Kaiser introduced fixed-cost contracts and performance bonuses tied to speed. When a yard beat its schedule, the workers shared in the reward. Pride and pay rose together. "We're not just building ships," one superintendent said. "We're building faith. Faith that Americans can do anything." The statistics began to sound like exaggeration. By 1943, Richmond's 4 yards launched 365 ships, an average of nearly one per day. At peak, a Liberty ship left the ways every 40 hours. The cranes never slept. The waterfront glowed red at night with the reflection of molten steel. From the hills above Berkeley, residents could watch entire hulls take shape under floodlights, as if the earth itself were producing them. But the miracle of speed carried unseen challenges. The faster ships were built, the less time there was for testing. Welders raced to meet quotas, sometimes working with minimal sleep. The early Liberty ships had structural weaknesses: brittle steel that could crack in polar waters, seams that failed under stress. When one ship broke in half off Alaska in 1943, critics resurfaced, claiming Kaiser's methods were reckless. The Navy's Bureau of Ships launched investigations. Kaiser cooperated fully, inviting engineers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Navy to study the failures. The verdict: not incompetence, but physics. Low temperatures and high stress had exposed flaws in the steel composition. The design was modified, and production continued almost without pause. The system absorbed its own mistakes. For Kaiser, setbacks were experiments. He told his engineers, "Every crack teaches us something. Every ship lost is a teacher for the next one." It was a philosophy borrowed from construction: build, test, improve, repeat. And in the furnace of total war, that iterative method proved faster than perfectionism. The shipyard's internal communications became legendary. A vast network of pneumatic tubes carried blueprints and memos across the facility, while loudspeakers delivered hourly updates. Section 4B, 20 minutes ahead, one would announce. Section 6C, watch your weld line. The yard became a living entity, each department a limb responding to the same nervous system. Visitors compared it to a heartbeat: constant, rhythmic, unstoppable. At the same time, Kaiser looked beyond production to the larger picture: the war's demand for transport, for replacement, for scale. He saw the Liberty ship not as an end, but as a prototype. He pushed for new designs: the Victory ships, faster and longer-lived successors to the Liberty ship. Even as he met quotas for 1943, he was sketching ideas for 1944. To Kaiser,
The shipyards never slept. By midnight, the fog rolled in from the bay, softening the light of 1,000 torches into a shimmering haze. Beneath the cranes, women in denim overalls walked home in groups, their faces streaked with soot and pride. Trains rattled in the distance, carrying steel from Pittsburgh, copper from Utah, and labor from every direction. Richmond had become a crossroads of America, a city born overnight for a single purpose: to build the vessels that would keep the world afloat. No one had planned for so many people. In 1940, the small industrial town counted barely 20,000 residents. By 1944, its population passed 120,000. Houses sprang up in fields, streets stretched into marshland, and trailer parks filled every empty lot. It was a human tide, drawn by the promise of work, good pay, and the feeling of being part of something larger than oneself. Kaiser's shipyards were more than workplaces. They were laboratories of a new social order. Women arrived first in small numbers, then in waves. They were mothers, widows, school teachers, farmhands. Many had never held a tool, but within weeks they could handle torches with precision. They learned quickly, adapted faster, and soon mastered the rhythms of industrial labor. "The torch doesn't care who holds it," one instructor said. The slogan spread. By 1943, nearly 1/3 of Richmond's workforce was female. They crawled through halls, welded seams overhead, drove cranes the size of houses. Newspapers called them Rosie the Riveters, although in Richmond they were Wendy the Welders. Their paychecks transformed families. Their confidence transformed society. When the men returned from the front, they would find a different kind of home front, one that had tasted independence. Not all found acceptance easily. Some unions resisted female workers, some men refused to share tools. But production needs overruled prejudice. Kaiser enforced integration on the shop floor. If you can weld, you're welcome. For many African American families, it was the first real taste of equality in labor. Crews mixed freely out of necessity and soon out of habit. On the catwalks, race mattered less than steady hands. A welder named Jesse Owens, not the Olympian, but a Texan migrant who shared the name, later recalled, "We all burned the same metal, breathed the same smoke. The ship didn't care what color you were." Still, tensions flared beyond the yards. Richmond's sudden boom brought overcrowding, rising rents, and culture clashes between newcomers and locals. The Kaiser Company and federal agencies responded by building schools, clinics, and recreation halls to stabilize the community. Many of these institutions endured, transforming the once sleepy town into a permanent city. Inside the gates, a quiet sense of equality took hold. Women supervised crews, black welders led training sessions, veterans of the Great Depression found themselves managers. The hierarchy of skill replaced the hierarchy of birth. A sociologist visiting in 1944 wrote that Kaiser's shipyards were the most democratic factory in America. It was not perfect, but it was progress measured in molten steel. Work rhythms shaped daily life. The yards ran 3 shifts: morning, swing, and graveyard, each overlapping by 30 minutes to maintain flow. At dawn, foghorns mixed with sirens calling workers to the docks. Cafeterias served eggs and coffee to thousands at a time. At noon, soup lines gave way to sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. At midnight, stew and bread fed the night crews. There were no holidays except launch days. Each completed ship earned a brief celebration, music from a brass band, and a moment of rest before the next keel was laid. Childcare centers operated 24 hours, run by nurses and teachers who became legends in their own right. For many children, the shipyard nursery was their first classroom. They drew pictures of cranes and ships instead of barns and trees. The war years created an entire generation raised by industry.
Accidents were inevitable in such vast work. Sparks could blind, falls could kill, fumes could choke. But compared to earlier heavy industries, safety improved dramatically. The Permanente Health Plan treated injuries swiftly and offered preventative care, unheard of in most factories. "We patched the men before we patched the ships," a nurse joked grimly. The approach saved lives and time, and after the war, it became the seed of a national healthcare model. Fatigue was constant, yet pride outweighed exhaustion. Letters home spoke of purpose. "Every time I strike a seam, I think of a soldier eating because this ship makes it through," one welder wrote. Posters reminded crews that every minute counted. One read, "The quicker we build, the quicker they come home." The message resonated more than any speech. The shipyards became communities unto themselves. They had orchestras, baseball teams, dance halls, and libraries. The Richmond Kaiser Shipyard Band played swing tunes between shifts. On weekends, workers crowded makeshift theaters to watch newsreels, sometimes glimpsing the very ships they had built sailing in convoys. The blend of exhaustion and optimism created a peculiar kind of camaraderie. Rivalries between yards were friendly but fierce. Crews painted slogans on halls: "Beat Yard 3" or "Built in 40 days, try that." The competition drove performance higher still. At monthly ceremonies, Kaiser handed out small bronze pins to workers who proposed efficiency improvements. By war's end, over 2,000 such ideas had been implemented. Behind the statistics were thousands of private dramas. Marriages formed on assembly lines. Families split under the pressure of relentless schedules. Some workers collapsed from exhaustion. Others refused to leave even when sick. The shared sense of urgency blurred personal boundaries. A foreman recalled, "We lived in the yard. We dreamed of the yard. It was like being at the front, only with sparks instead of bullets." And indeed, the workers felt part of the battle. They read casualty reports in the morning paper and measured them against the ships launched that week. When news came of Liberty ships sunk in the North Atlantic, memorials were held in the canteen. Sometimes the same name appeared on a hull and in the obituary column. The connection between builder and sailor was intimate, almost sacred. The social transformation extended beyond Richmond. Across the country, Kaiser's example reshaped labor relations. Unions that at once resisted rapid production embraced it under new incentive programs. Women's participation in heavy industry surged nationwide. African American workers gained bargaining power and experience that would later fuel the civil rights movement. The shipyards had become engines of social change as much as engines of war. Meanwhile, government officials took notice. The Office of War Information filmed documentaries at Richmond, showing rows of women wielding torches, multiracial crews cheering as ships slid into water. These images circulated worldwide as proof of democratic unity. Axis propaganda called them lies. The images themselves made that impossible to believe. By 1944, Kaiser's workforce exceeded 190,000 people across all yards. Turnover was high, fatigue constant, yet output never faltered. The sense of collective mission, the idea that every hand built freedom, sustained them. Workers began to describe themselves not as laborers, but as soldiers of industry. "Our battlefield," one woman said, "was the assembly line." The pace transformed the landscape itself. At night, the hills around Richmond glowed red from furnace light. Residents in San Francisco could see the reflections on the clouds. The constant clang of metal became the city's lullaby. Trains carried finished sections to the docks. Whistles announced each successful launch. It was noise, chaos, and beauty all at once, the sound of a nation remaking itself. Yet beneath the pride lay exhaustion. Housing shortages forced families into crowded quarters. Inflation ate away at wages. Children grew up with fathers overseas and mothers working double shifts. The toll was invisible but deep. After the war, sociologists would describe it as the home front line. These sacrifices rarely made headlines, but without them, the ships would have remained drawings on paper. As 1944 dawned, Richmond reached its zenith. 4 shipyards, each the size of a small city, churned day and night. The launch schedule was relentless, nearly 1 ship every 24 hours across the complex. Workers marked time not by calendars, but by whole numbers. The phrase, "another one tomorrow," became a mantra.
By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic War had entered a new rhythm. Convoys that once limped across the ocean now surged in disciplined columns, Liberty ships by the hundreds, escorted by destroyers, their decks stacked with tanks, jeeps, munitions, and food. From the air, they looked like floating assembly lines, stretching to the horizon. The men who sailed them joked that the sea itself had become a conveyor belt. For the first time in 4 years, the Allies had more ships than the U-boats had torpedoes. Each vessel carried the heartbeat of a shipyard worker. On a foggy morning in March, as convoy HX-280 left Halifax, an able seaman traced his fingers across the letters welded into the bulkhead. Made in Richmond, California. He didn't know who had written them, but he whispered, "Thank you." Thousands of miles away, welders were already finishing another haul, unaware that their work had just saved a stranger's life. The numbers were staggering. By mid-1944, the United States was producing 1 ship every 4.5 days on average. Kaiser's 7 yards alone launched more than 1,490 Liberty ships, 50 Victory ships, and hundreds of tankers, escort carriers, and repair vessels. The shipyards had become an empire of movement, where steel and human effort merged into momentum. Each launch was both a spectacle and a strategy. And yet, for all the triumphs, the war's human cost shadowed every achievement. The North Atlantic remained brutal: ice, storms, and the unseen threat beneath the waves. When the Liberty ship SS John A. Johnson went down off Greenland, word reached Richmond within days. The crew's names were read aloud in the cafeteria. Torches were lowered in silence. Then the next shift began. The work never stopped. Grief had become another material to be shaped, folded into purpose. The record set by the Robert E. Peary a year earlier still stood, but its meaning had evolved. Speed was no longer spectacle, it was survival. What had begun as a wager now defined an era. Kaiser's engineers refined their methods further, using rolling cradles that allowed holes to slide between bays, creating a flow so continuous that a keel laid at sunrise might see its superstructure by nightfall. Time, one supervisor said, is our strongest alloy. Admiral Emery S. Land, once Kaiser's skeptic, now visited the yards regularly. Photographs show him standing beside the builder at a launching, his uniform dusted with grit, his face lit by the same reflected torchlight. "You were right, Henry," he admitted publicly. "Shipbuilding will never be the same." It was more than praise, it was confession. The industrial miracle spread its logic beyond the coast. Aircraft plants borrowed Kaiser's scheduling charts. Tank factories in Detroit installed welding lines modeled on Richmond's bays. Even agricultural equipment firms studied his labor practices. America had discovered a new pattern of creation: modular, inclusive, relentless. In Germany, the effect was palpable. Intelligence reports from 1944 describe U-boat commanders despairing at the endless convoys. Admiral Donitz himself wrote, "They replace ships faster than we can sink them." In that sentence lay the strategic turning point of the war. Production had become offense. Logistics had become weaponry. The final year of combat saw Liberty ships at every invasion and landing. They carried the 8th Army to Sicily, the 5th Army to Italy, and the storming divisions to Normandy. On June 6, 1944, as dawn broke over Omaha Beach, Liberty hulls anchored offshore formed the backbone of the Allied supply fleet. Many were later deliberately grounded to form temporary piers, the famed Mulberry Harbors, turning cargo vessels into solid bridges of steel. Even in death, they served. Back home, the war's momentum began to shift from desperation to inevitability. Kaiser sensed it before most. "The storm is breaking," he told his managers. "Now we must think of the peace." He had already drafted blueprints for a post-war world. Homes made from prefabricated panels, cars built with wartime precision, hospitals offering universal care. He believed that the discipline of necessity could become the engine of prosperity. But first, the job had to be finished. The yards pushed harder through 1944 and into 1945. New techniques cut average construction time to 39 days. The workforce peaked near 200,000. Entire families worked together. Fathers riveting, mothers welding, sons apprenticing as electricians. It was like a city made of noise, one recalled. You could feel history under your feet. The end came swiftly. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, its ports silent, its U-boats scuttled. 3 months later, Japan followed. For the first time in years, Richmond was quiet. The torches dimmed, the cranes slowed, and the great machine that had built faster than war began to rest. Workers stood at the gates unsure what came next. Some celebrated, others wept. Peace, longed for and feared, had arrived. Henry Kaiser walked through the silent yard one evening that summer. The bay reflected the orange light of sunset instead of welding arcs. Empty slipways stretched before him like scars of triumph. Reporters asked what he would do now. "He build," he answered simply. "That's all I've ever done." And he did. He shifted from ships to homes, founding Kaiser Community Homes to provide affordable housing for returning soldiers. He invested in aluminum production, launching the Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation. He turned his wartime health system into a permanent network, Kaiser Permanente, one of the first large-scale prepaid medical plans in America. The same logic that had built ships now built communities. Across the Pacific, his influence endured. Japanese shipbuilders rebuilding their shattered industry studied the Richmond model, adopting its block construction and parallel assembly lines. South Korea's fledgling yards followed in the 1960s, eventually surpassing all others in scale and efficiency. Every modern ship that glides from a dockyard today owes something to Kaizen's wartime experiment. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, only a handful survive. Most served quietly for decades before being scrapped. 2 remain fully operational: the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. Their engines still thrum with the same slow rhythm that once carried convoys across the Atlantic. When the O'Brien steamed under the Golden Gate Bridge again in 1994, 50 years after D-Day, old welders stood on the pier and cried. The ship they had built in haste had outlived the war. The legacy of the shipyards is not only measured in steel or tonnage. It lies in the millions of lives altered by the work. The women who discovered independence never forgot it. The black families who found dignity in labor carried that pride into the civil rights battles of the 1950s and 60s. The idea that ordinary citizens, given purpose and trust, could achieve the extraordinary became a permanent article of American faith. Economists later calculated that Kaiser's methods shortened the war by months, perhaps a year. But historians prefer another metric: the change in belief. Before 1942, few imagined that free people, without compulsion or coercion, could mobilize so completely. The Liberty Ship program proved otherwise. Democracy could be disciplined. Creativity could be collective. In Richmond today, the skeletons of the shipyards remain. The concrete slipways lie quiet,
but the buildings have been preserved as the Rosie the Riveter and World War II Homefront National Historical Park. Visitors walk through cavernous spaces where torches once blazed and listen to recordings of the workers who made history, one weld at a time. Their voices are ordinary, their words simple. We were just doing our jobs. Yet those jobs changed the course of the 20th century. Kaiser himself died in 1967, long after the noise of the yards had faded, but his vision endured. He left behind hospitals, factories, foundations, and a philosophy that no problem is insoluble if approached with imagination and urgency. On his desk at the end of his life was a framed photograph of the Robert E. Peary sliding into the bay, surrounded by a sea of cheering workers. Beneath it, he had written a single line: "This is what people can do when they believe in tomorrow." The Liberty ships were never beautiful. They were angular, utilitarian, and plain. But beauty was never the point. Their grace lay in their purpose, their strength in their simplicity. They embodied a truth born of crisis, that endurance is its own form of elegance. Each hull was a sentence in a larger story, one not written by generals or politicians, but by welders, machinists, mothers, and migrants. Together they built a fleet faster than fear, and in doing so, they built the modern world. When the sun sets over San Francisco Bay and the wind carries the faint clang of distant docks, it is easy to imagine the ghostly echo of that wartime chorus. The hammers ring, the whistles cry, and the cheer as another Liberty ship takes the water. In that echo,